not employ Americans, that is dead wrong. So I urge my colleagues to pass this legislation, reject the amendments that are going to be offered. They are not the amendments they should be. At this time, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska yields back his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. The amendment printed in the bill is adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in House Report 112-74. Each further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided, and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, as the designee of the Chairman, Doc Hastings, I have an amendment made in order under the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in House Report Number 112-74, offered by Mr. Young of Alaska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska as the designee of Mr. Hastings.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment that corrects a drafting error in the bill that was discovered by the Legislative Council after H.R. 1231 was reported from the committee with bipartisan support. The amendment changes the paragraph numbers in Section 2 so they correctly reflect the sequence of appearance in the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and I urge support for the amendment.
The gentleman, does the gentleman reserve his time? The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Opposition, although we have no objection.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
We have no objection, and we urge a swift passage. And I to balance my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. The gentleman from Alaska?
Back.
The gentleman from Alaska yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Mr. Hastings, by the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, for the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in House Report Number 112-74, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chair. Mr. Chairman, this simple amendment clarifies that any expanded oil production will not interfere with ongoing operations by the armed forces of the United States. I appreciate Congressman Bobby Scott and Congressman Jim Moran, their co-sponsorship of this amendment. There are no stronger advocates for the military in my state than those two gentlemen. As you know, the United States has more than 24 coastal and naval bases, including those located in Virginia, Washington, California, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, and Hawaii. The Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Readiness published a report noting that many of these potential locations for oil exploration could and might conflict with DoD operations in these locations. For example, DoD has surface, subsurface operating areas and DoD special use airspace warning areas off every coastal state in continental United States. And you can see from this map the red dots are where they actually have bases, and the spider webs are where they have operations offshore. These areas are important because the military uses in some of these areas for surface and subsurface training as well as practice of live ordnance. Oil wells and live ordnance don't mix so well. For example, the Norfolk Naval Base in my home state of Virginia uses 78% of the proposed lease sale Area 220 right now for training and live ordnance practice. The Navy wants to ensure that oil drilling in that area does not interfere with live ordnance release and impact, including air-to-surface bombing, sensitive undersea and surface operations, combined shipboard systems qualification trials, and equipment testing and evaluation. Norfolk is America's largest naval base and a major driver of our state's annual $10 billion government contracting economy. It would be difficult to quantify how many billions of dollars taxpayers have spent building and maintaining these military installations all around the continental United States, but relocation costs would be substantial, and we don't have that money. My friend from Alaska talks about putting people out of work or people into work. Believe me, if we had to close or relocate these bases, there'd be a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth in the unemployment line all across America. And the cost wouldn't just be borne by the taxpayers, Mr. Speaker, because also by the servicemen and women who would have to relocate and the tens of thousands of contractor employees who rely on the DoD. Perhaps it's possible to co-locate oil drilling infrastructure in areas now used by the Navy or other components of the armed forces. In that case, this amendment would not get in the way of the oil exploration. This amendment simply ensures that any additional oil drilling which takes place in accordance with this bill will not conflict with national security operations of the armed forces. I'm sure that energy development and national security can be mutually reinforcing and compatible, and I hope that my colleagues from the other side of the aisle would support this common-sense amendment to protect our national defense and national security. I know we can all agree that preserving those should be paramount as we consider changes to our nation's energy policy. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time to the ranking manager.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman
I
from
claim
Alaska
opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself much time I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it's no surprise I oppose this amendment. Both the Outer Continental Land Shelf Act and the 2003 National Defense Act already fully protect the Defense Department's responsibility in the Outer Continental Shelf and the state coastal areas of the OCS. H.R. 1231 continues these protections. As Chairman Hastings stated last week during debate on a very similar amendment to H.R. 1230, preserving the working relationship between the Department of Defense and the Department of Interior is of great importance to the National Resources Committee. Because of this, H.R. 1231 meets the mutual goals of balancing national security and energy independence. But this amendment would upset the balance. May I say, Mr. Chairman, the Department of Defense never notified, never talked to us about any opposition to this legislation. H.R. 1231 fully supports the Department of Interior's work with the Department of Defense in addressing the necessary stipulation that will protect the military mission on the OCS during the development of lease sales. I also want to point out that gaining access to domestically available and affordable energy resources is also of paramount importance to our national security because it lessens our dependence on foreign sources of energy. Let me say that again. It must be very clear energy security and energy independence is a national security priority. Additionally, development of our own energy resources benefits the Department of Defense. According to the Brookings Institute, every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil increases defense operation by $1.3 billion. $1.3 billion. Lowering energy prices should be a priority for American consumer and the Department of Defense. This amendment isn't truly aimed at protecting DoD activities. It's aimed at trying to block lease sales and stopping offshore energy development. That's what this is about, and I congratulate the people who are offering this amendment. Exactly what you'd like to do. Again, defense activities are not hindered by energy development. The Departments of Defense and Interior work well together to balance the needs of our nation. H.R. 1231 will allow both offshore energy leasing and military activities to go forward and exist in a safe, responsible way, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
I thank the chair, and I would just say to my friend from Alaska, I won't have anybody question my sincerity about trying to protect the national security interests of the United States of America. I come from a state with a long military tradition. I'm proud of that tradition, and I'm here sincerely to protect national security. If we want to disagree with that, that's fine. But questioning the motivations and whether there's another agenda is a different matter. Mr. Chairman, I now yield the balance of my time to my distinguished colleague from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, is recognized.
May I ask the Chair how much time has remained?
You have 1 minute.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. I thank my good friend from Virginia, and I would say to my good friend from Alaska, remind him that the U.S. Atlantic Fleet is based at the Norfolk Naval Base and operates in the same waters that this legislation proposes to sell for oil and gas development. Filling this area with drilling rigs is a bad idea. Now, we have been told verbally and in writing that there should be no lease sales in 72% of this lease area because it's in direct conflict with the operations of the Navy. 5% in addition would interfere with aerial operations and should not host permanent surface structures like drilling rigs. And then there's another 1% that would have site-specific stipulations. And then you're left with 22%, and much of that 22% is dedicated to the shipping lanes for the country's two busiest commercial ports, Hampton Roads and Baltimore. There are other areas offshore, I'm sure, that are also important to the armed forces, but we're responsible for Virginia. We know the situation there. We're not going to jeopardize those jobs, and I would say that national security interests ought to trump oil and gas development. I thank the chairman, and I thank my friend who has introduced this amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Alaska.
Does any time remaining on both sides?
The gentleman from Alaska has 3 minutes. The gentleman from Virginia's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. It's unnecessary. And boy, if we can't get the government to work together, there's something wrong, something deadly wrong. This is about defense. It's about the Department of Interior. It's about the American people. We ought to be able to work together, and I'm sure they can. I'm confident of it. And the idea that this is going to hurt the mission is, again, a way to stop drilling. That's all it is. And maybe if we had that 23% open and we knew exactly where it was, we might be able to drill there. But I don't think they would support that either. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge a no on this amendment and yield back the balance.
All time has been yielded back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on this matter, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
I rise in support of my amendment, which is at the desk.
Does the gentleman offer the amendment?
I offer the amendment at this time, yes.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report Number 112-74, offered by Mr. Markey of Massachusetts.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the chair, and I yield myself as much time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in the first quarter of this year, the oil companies actually were able to make $35 billion in profits. But in my amendment, we're able to say to them that because of a flaw in leases in the 1990s, which require them to pay no royalties on public lands, taxpayers' lands, for oil they're drilling for right now and charging $100 a barrel, $4 a gallon at the pump, that there's something wrong when the taxpayers don't get anything back. And so what my amendment says is that they can't apply for any more leases on taxpayers' land unless they're willing to renegotiate the mistaken leases that were given to them that, by the way, will allow them to escape having to pay $53 billion in taxes, in royalties. That's another word for taxes, royalties. When you're talking about oil, royalties is the word we use to describe taxes. And so this blank check to the oil industry is absolutely, undeserved. The Republican approach to offshore oil royalty policy is to treat the big oil companies like royalty and to treat the consumers and taxpayers like peasants. We're just going to give away all of these breaks to the oil industry. Prince William and Kate Middleton just left on their honeymoon. Their royalty honeymoon is just beginning, but for the oil companies who are drilling for free on public land, they have a royalty honeymoon that has been going on for way too long. And today we're going to give the members of the House a chance to end the honeymoon on the royalties that the oil industry has to pay. Now, what are the Republicans going to do? They're going to oppose it. They're going to say, no, we need more tax breaks, $4 billion worth of tax breaks for the oil industry. And so where are they going to find the money for those additional tax breaks that they want to give to the oil industry? Well, they looked around and they decided that the best place to find it was in Medicare, that is, in the health care that we give to grandma and grandpa. And so what they've done is they've set up a drilling rig for the oil industry on top of the Medicare program so they can drill in to the pockets of grandma and grandpa to find the $4 billion in tax breaks. And then on top of that, protect them against having to pay the royalties, the taxes, on where they're already drilling for free on taxpayers' land in our country. Now, that's an unbelievable combination. And they do it while cutting the renewables budget by 70%. Can you believe this? It's 2011. The Republicans have already passed a bill cutting the renewables budget, wind and solar, biomass, geothermal, by 70%. And they're setting up an oil rig on top of the Medicare program of grandma and grandpa to drill for even more tax breaks for the oil industry. This is just an unbelievable debate that we're having. And they say over here, well, we're the all of the above party. We want to do it all. But the truth is that they're really the oil above all party. And that's what this debate's all about. How can we get even more for the oil industry? So what my amendment will do is to just give people an opportunity to reclaim that $53 billion from the oil industry and give it to grandma. Of all the people who don't need a break, a subsidy this year, it's the oil industry. You know who needs a break? You know who needs a subsidy? It's grandma. Let's not cut Medicare. Let's not cut her health care in order to help the oil industry. Vote aye for the Markey Amendment.
Does the gentleman yield back his time? The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from
I rise
Alaska
in opposition, and, all due respects to grandma and grandpa.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
There's no grandma or grandpas being taking Medicare away from them or anything else. That's pure demagoguery on this floor, and we know that, tied into the oil companies. And it's ironic to me, this House has debated and voted on this amendment over the years. They defeated it by bipartisan votes. It's like a bad penny. It keeps showing up, and the big oils are all bad. All I know is the American public is being taxed every year $1,100 every year by this administration's high gas prices. And let's review the facts. The Deepwater Royalty Relief Act leases were issued by, oh boy, Bill Clinton, Bruce Babbitt, in 1996 and 2000. Oh, my good Lord, it was the Republicans that do all this. They're the ones that issue these leases, and those that hold these leases have repeatedly been successful challenged the Interior Department's authority to include price thresholds and lease agreements. The Department of the Interior has lost at Federal District Court, the Appellate Court, in the United States Supreme Court. And now we're going to interfere with a court decision? And if this amendment passed, those holding such leases would be required to renegotiate a contract, the lease terms with DOI, to include price thresholds before getting new leases. Bill Clinton would turn over, now he's not in his grave, so I can't say that. The Secretary does not have the authority to include price thresholds on these leases. In addition, forcing companies to renegotiate the leases would be a violation of contract law and would be challenged in court. Mr. Chairman, this is an amendment. It just comes out of where I don't know. It's a time of demagogue on the floor about Medicare. It has nothing to do with oil leases. It has nothing to do with those so-called tax breaks that Bill Clinton and Bruce Babbitt put in place. George Bush wasn't there. Mr. Obama wasn't there. Bill Clinton did this. Lo and behold, somebody's have to renegotiate something. Let's start renegotiating contracts all over the countryside. Maybe we ought to start doing that. Some of the contracts made, and I think we did this the last election, their contracts were terminated. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska yields back. The gentleman from Alaska reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts has 30 seconds remaining and is recognized.
And how, could you inform me as to how much time the
gentleman from Alaska has 2.5 minutes remaining.
2.5 minutes left. I am the last speaker on my side, and I don't know if there are any other speakers except for the gentleman from Alaska on their side.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Alaska has the right to close. The gentleman from Alaska reserves.
Okay.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you. We have a big choice here. We can reclaim $53 billion from the oil and gas industry that they owe to the American taxpayer and put it into wind and solar and all-electric vehicles and the revolution that we need to transform our country's relationship with OPEC. We should be able to tell OPEC we don't need your oil any more than we need your sand. This is a chance here to reclaim the $53 billion in windfall profits by escaping taxes that the oil industry has engaged in the last 15 years and put it into a new technology innovation agenda that talks about the future of wind and solar and electric vehicles that will transform our relationship with the rest of the planet.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Alaska.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the gentleman from Massachusetts' comments. But wind power is subsidized energy. That's all it is. Wind power is subsidized by the taxpayer. Solar power is subsidized by the taxpayer. And to try to transform this country into using wind and solar by raising the cost of gasoline to the American consumer is dead wrong. That's not the way to solve this problem. I will support wind power when it's not subsidized. I will support solar power when it's not subsidized. And I will support nuclear power when we can, with the gentleman's opposed every time. And I'll support hydropower. In fact, I'll support all forms of power so we can become more independent. And I go back to the concept of fossil fuels. It moves objects. It moves objects. Wind power doesn't move objects. No. Solar power doesn't move objects. No. It takes fossil fuels to run our ships, our planes, our automobiles, our trucks, and our trains. That's the commerce of this nation. And that's what's hurting this nation today in the recovery. We have to start producing our own fossil fuels so we can have the commerce that's necessary to employ people and create the jobs in this country. In this country, it should be done. Yes, we can have the other forms of power, but we have to have the fossil fuels to continue, hopefully, the recovery of this country economically. And so I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time having been yielded back, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for...
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman asks for a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Mr. Keating of Massachusetts.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise to urge my colleagues to support my amendment to H.R. 1231. As our constituents see soaring gas prices, oil companies have revealed record profits. The top 5 multinational oil companies earned over $1 trillion in the past decade. These firms are eating up more and more of our constituents' paychecks. And where is it going? Only a small portion of the profits are reinvested back into the company to pave the way for efficiencies and research into alternatives to oil. Rather, oil companies are providing bumps to stockholders and high bonuses to their company executives, a pat on the back for high prices at the pump. My amendment would provide transparency for the U.S. taxpayer. The amendment requires the Secretary to disclose the executive bonuses for any company that is given a drilling lease. The time is now to hold the largest oil companies accountable. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment in order to provide transparency back to the American taxpayer. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska rise?
I thank you, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Does the gentleman claim the time in opposition?
I claim in time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, when I first saw this amendment, I was wondering if we were debating financial services legislation here on the floor. Clearly, this amendment attempts to raise issues outside the realm of today's debate on increasing American-made energy and creating jobs. The Department of Interior should spend its time focusing on reviewing permits, conducting environmental and safety reviews, protecting our resources, and leasing offshore areas that are most prospective for oil and gas production. The Department doesn't have dozens of employees sitting around reading company securities and exchange commissions filings and assembling a list of which executives got to do what bonus. The information in this amendment would burden the Interior Department with gathering and publishing is already publicly disclosed. It should be made public, and that's why it already is. This amendment is not about openness and transparency of disclosing information. That's already law. The real effect of this amendment is duplicative requirements and government waste. Let's get away from the political games and gotcha amendments. Let's allow the Department of Interior to focus on OCS safety, environmental protection and leasing, and leave the bonuses to the Security and Exchange Commission and studying that group. I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in terms of the relevancy to this debate, I would take this time in the spirit of bipartisanship to thank the Rules Committee for allowing this amendment, and thus I agree with them that this is relevant to this debate. I would like to comment one more thing. My friend from Alaska brought up the point of a burden. The burden that exists right now is the burden that's being borne right on the gas pumps of the people in my district, in his district, and the people in the United States of America. That is the burden that working families are undergoing, the suffering that they are undertaking, as they pay over $4 a gallon for gasoline in my district. Transparency and accountability are necessary, though the people who are beholden to the price spikes know where their money is going. Thank you.
Does the gentleman yield back?
I'll reserve. Thank you.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Alaska.
I have a right to close, and I reserve it this time.
The gentleman from Alaska is correct. He does have the right to close. The
I
gentleman
yield
from
back my time.
Massachusetts yields back his time. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
The question I ask is how much would this cost the Department of Interior? Will this take away from safety inspections? And my good friend from Massachusetts, the burden is going to get worse. You're going to be paying about $5 a gallon by the 1st of June, if not a little bit, maybe a little bit later, but not later than the 4th of July. And the burden is something that bothers me a great deal, but in Massachusetts alone, not one time has any one of your members in the Congress ever voted to produce energy other than wind power and solar power. And that doesn't drive your constituents' automobiles. That doesn't drive your trucks that deliver your products to the restaurants and the hospitals. That doesn't drive that train that people ride to try to get automobiles off the road. It doesn't drive the ships that bring the products to your shores. Fossil fuel is the key to our commerce. And we should recognize this in this Congress. And we should develop an energy plan that includes everything. You can't do it with just wind power. You can't do it with solar power. But you can do it with all powers. And that's what's wrong with this Congress and this administration, yes, previous administrations. They don't grasp the necessity of having more power available to increase the economy of this country. And we're on the cusp right now. If we don't do something right, and I believe this bill will help us, if it does not help us, then give me another solution. I have not seen it on that side of the aisle. You back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, all time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request a vote. I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman requests a recorded vote pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Ms. Songas of Massachusetts.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the lady from Massachusetts, Mrs. Songas, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the lady from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The lady is recognized.
Last summer, we all saw the painfully disorganized and ineffective response to the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. The frustration was palpable across our country. During that tragedy, it was clear that BP and the federal government had no plan to contain the oil spill and that BP lacked the capacity to respond to a spill of that magnitude. The amendment that I am offering today is very straightforward and simple, one that seeks to implement the lessons learned from the events of last summer. My amendment would require that all applicants for a drilling permit under a lease sold under H.R. 1231 submit a plan for containment and cleanup of a worst-case scenario oil or gas spill. This amendment does not limit drilling. It says simply and sensibly that when we drill, we should have a plan in place before an accident occurs. We shouldn't wait until a disaster like last year's 3-month-long spill has already begun. There wasn't a person I spoke to who wasn't horrified by the devastating oil spill in the Gulf. I believe that the American people want us to learn from that environmental and economic tragedy, and this amendment helps us accomplish that. When we drill, we should have a plan for dealing with possible disaster. Some have argued that we don't need a law because initial steps are being taken at the agency level or by oil and gas companies. Some have said that requiring a worst-case scenario plan is anti-drilling or anti-jobs. We shouldn't get distracted from the simple truth of this amendment. When we drill, we should have a plan. We have seen the consequences of not having a plan, and it was lost jobs. This amendment is pro-jobs. Requiring oil and gas companies to have a plan in place will not prevent the creation of a single oil and gas job, but it will protect fishing jobs and tourism jobs instead of asking us to put those jobs at risk should a spill occur. Our constituents deserve to know that we have required oil and gas companies to plan for the worst. Opposing this amendment irresponsibly denies the tragic events of last summer. For the sake of our economy, our environment, and our coastal jobs, I urge my colleagues to support this common-sense, simple amendment requiring oil and gas companies to have a plan. Join me in demonstrating to our constituents that we have learned from the events of last summer, and we are taking steps to prevent such a disaster in the future. I reserve the balance of my time.
The lady reserves the balance of her time. For
Mr.
what
Chairman,
purpose does the gentleman from Alaska
I
rise?
claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman, unfortunately, I oppose this amendment. Here again is another amendment that is redundant, but let's call it what it is. It's an obstruction. The Department of the Interior already requires that applicants must calculate worst-case discharge before approving a permit. On June 18th, 2010, the Department of the Interior issued a notice of lease to lessees outlining the information requirements and standards to be met before a permit could be approved. In the notice, it is required that a lessee describe the assumption and calculation that we use to determine the volume of your worst-case scenario. It's already required on permit applications today and is further radiated by the language in H.R. 1229, which passed the House earlier today. The minority continues to try to divert attention away from the real issue of increasing energy production, creating jobs, lowering energy costs, and improving national security by lessening our dependence on foreign oil. In fact, it seems that the Democrats simply do not want to face the fact that this bill says we can move forward with the aggressive program of responsible oil and gas development, while at the same time ensuring that increased safety measures are undertaken. These are not mutually exclusive goals. The Republicans want to make U.S. offshore drilling the safest in the world, and it is the safest in the world, so we can produce more American energy, create American jobs, and strengthen our national security. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The lady from Massachusetts.
I thank my colleague for bringing this issue up. The June 18th notice to lessees is a great first step toward having worst-case scenario containment and cleanup plans. But a notice to lessees is not the same as legislation. It is not intended to set policy, and it is not intended to have the force of law, which is why I am offering this amendment today. We need federal laws, not notices, that require companies to submit worst-case scenario oil spill containment and cleanup plans to ensure that another spill like the BP spill never happens again. Our constituents deserve to know that we have required oil and gas companies to plan for the worst or give them an honest reason why we think no such plan is necessary given the events last summer. If the majority agrees that we should have a plan, they should support this amendment. It simply requires that oil and gas companies have a plan, nothing more. It is about drilling safely. It protects jobs, oil and gas jobs, tourism, and fishing jobs. And again, as I said, if the majority agrees that we should have a plan, they should support this amendment. Thank you. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The lady reserves the balance of her
I have a
time.
right to close.
The gentleman from Alaska is correct. He has the right to close. The gentleman reserves his time. The lady from Massachusetts.
I yield to my esteemed colleague.
Does the lady yield back her time?
I yield back my time.
The lady from Massachusetts yields back her time. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I can only say that, to my knowledge, there's little chance of any oil drilling off the coast of Massachusetts, but there is a great possibility off the coast of Florida, Virginia, Alaska, California, and this bill really sets out which areas should be drilled, not large masses areas, but specifically. And I personally will tell you, if I could drill in Alaska offshore, which we should be able to do, but this administration has delayed a permit for 5 years. 5 years. $5 billion put into investment to develop that field. Can't be done because of this administration. This bill tries to expedite that process for the good of this nation and for the good of the people, not the good of the oil companies, because we need that oil. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, all time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the lady from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment.
That vote, Mr. Chairman, I request a yeas and nays.
The lady requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the lady from Massachusetts will be postponed. Let me give you that. Take this back. Okay. It is now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the lady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Ms. Brown of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the lady from Florida, Ms. Brown, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the lady from Florida.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The lady is recognized.
I rise today to offer to H.R. 1231 an amendment that would make the current ban on drilling in the East Gulf of Mexico permanent. This amendment would not have any effect on the budget as scored by the Congressional Budget Office. However, it would have a significant impact on the economy of Florida, given that the state tourist industry will be protected from future oil spills, which could destroy our beautiful beaches and coastal areas. Certainly, Florida coastline is a treasure not just for Floridians, but for all Americans and people throughout the world. For years, the Florida delegation have worked together to protect our coastline and natural resources. And as long as those rigs in this area, the potential for devastation to Florida beaches persists. If an accident was to occur, causing oil to wash ashore into Florida beaches, both the environment and the economy damage would be devastating to the state. And following the disaster off of Louisiana Gulf Coast last year, we saw a quick glimpse of what could happen to Florida economy in the event of an oil spill. I toured the region by helicopter last year and witnessed the devastation firsthand. That said, before any new areas are opened and Florida Christine beaches are put at risk, I would very much like to see drilling in the areas that are already open and an increased funding for research for new technology. I strongly believe that any drilling off of Florida Gulf Coast would be extremely deterrent to the state economy and the ecosystem. As we saw in the BP oil spill last year in the Gulf of Mexico, within 11 workers died and an estimated 5 million barrels of crude oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico. The risk of drilling oil off of Florida shores bring about extreme risk to our state in an already depressed economy, and with unemployment in the state of Florida still hovering at 11%. The last thing we need is to endanger nearly 1 million tourist-related jobs and 60 billion tourist industry in the Sunshine State. Drilling off the coast of Florida is a misguided miscalculation. The risk of danger to the environment and the economy greatly outweighs any potential benefits. I would very much like to see increased drilling in areas already open and increased funding for research for new technology. I reserve the balance of my time.
The lady from Florida reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska rise?
I claim opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. The underlying bill is focused on opening the outer continental shelf to safe and responsible energy production. This bill aims to fulfill the promise that both Democrats and Republicans made to the American people when we voted on a bipartisan basis in 2008 to lift the moratorium on offshore energy production. Since taking office, President Obama and his administration has effectively reimposed a moratorium. This bill would reverse his actions. The December 2006, a majority of the House and Florida delegates voted in favor of the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, a bipartisan compromise that opened a portion of the western and central Gulf by maintaining the eastern planning area moratorium in 2022. This amendment seeks to go backwards and single-handedly undo that agreement, to close off forever the possible energy production in portion of the Gulf of Mexico. This is exactly the wrong direction for America to be heading. Congress should not foreclose the possibility of future energy production. This is especially true in the eastern planning area of the Gulf, which the Department of Interior believes contains technically recoverable resources of the amount of 4 billion barrels of oil and over 21 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Let's be clear, the area in the eastern Gulf covered by this amendment is currently under moratorium until 2022. That is over a decade from now. This bill does not, I repeat, does not propose to change the 2022 date. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska reserves. The lady from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
The lady has 2 minutes remaining.
More than 20 years after the Exxon Valdez
Ladies
oil
recognized.
spill, we have yet to clean up Prince William Sound in Alaska. Oil is still being found buried in sand from the BP oil spill. The frequent occurrence of extreme weather that the East Gulf Coast experienced, including hurricanes and severe storms, could easily produce an oil spill, even with the technological improvement in oil and natural gas. Storms along the Gulf Coast in 2005 caused 124 oil spills in the water of the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Katrina, 233 gallons of oil spill, and Hurricane Rita worsened the damage with 508 gallons of oil spill. If these rigs was in the Gulf Coast, our beaches would face complete destruction. As we've seen recently, cleanup methods for these spills are incapable of removing more than a small fraction of the oil. In addition, from the BP oil spill, Florida had over 284,000 claims for only 117,000 paid, with less than half for the total of over $1.45 billion. For the Gulf Toll region, 10,000 fishing claims, 122,000 food and lodge claims, 74,000 retail and sales claim, and a total of $1.6 billion paid on even more lost earnings and wages. We cannot afford another disaster in the magnitude. With more drilling, we still living on borrowed time. Support the Corrine Brown amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back her time. The gentleman from Alaska.
I urge my colleagues no on this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time, all time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the lady from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The
I ask for a recorded vote.
The lady requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the lady from Florida will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in House Report number 112-74, offered by Mr. Thompson of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to this bill's drafters, the legislation would not require leasing permits in the Northern California planning area, which is the coastline of my district. My amendment merely makes that clear. Drilling on the north coast of California is a disastrous idea, and the legislation must be clear that it's not acceptable to drill off California's north coast. Because this amendment is a clarification of the legislation's intent, there's no cost associated with it. Just about 3 weeks ago, we marked the one-year anniversary of the nation's worst oil spill. I will not let what happened to the Gulf of Mexico happen to the north coast of California. I've introduced separate standalone legislation which would permanently ban drilling off the coast of my district. It's important to me and to my constituents that H.R. 1231 clearly notates that drilling will not occur in the Northern California planning area along the coasts of Mendocino, Humboldt, and Del Norte counties. The coastal area
of my district is one of only 4 major upwellings in our world's oceans. An upwelling is where cold, nutrient-rich waters are brought from the ocean depths to the surface. Upwelling regions promote seaweed and growth, which in turn supply energy for some of the most productive ecosystems in our world, including many of our world's fisheries. North Coast ecosystems also sustain some of the largest salmon populations in the lower 49 states and provide essential habitat for Dungeness crab, rockfish, sole, and urchin. In 2006 and 2008, commercial fishery disasters that virtually eliminated salmon fishing in California were economically disastrous to my district, to our states, and our nation. If an oil spill were to occur off the coast of my district, the environmental and economic costs would be staggering. Drilling for oil or gas off California's north coast could cause serious harm to the unique and productive ecosystem and abundant marine life found in this area. My district is economically dependent upon the rich natural resources we're blessed to have, but it's also subject to significant earthquakes, which exacerbate the issues, the threats, and the problems related to oil spills. One of my counties just wrote to me, and I quote, they said, "The modest amount of oil available in terms of our nation's daily demand does not justify jeopardizing our fisheries, our environment, and our economic livelihoods." End quote. This amendment will merely protect the north coast of California and will simply clarify what the drafters of this bill says that the bill does, and that is that they claim that it does not require drilling off the coasts of Mendocino, Humboldt, or Del Norte counties. I urge a yes vote on this, and I reserve the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska
I claim opposition to
rise?
the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. Mr. Chairman, this is the second amendment of 3 today designed to close off portions of an outer continental shelf to oil and natural gas exploration and production. The opposite of what the bill under consideration today is about. The underlying bill is focused on opening the outer continental shelf to safe and responsible energy production. H.R. 1231 aims to fulfill the promise that both Democrats and Republicans made to the American people when we voted on a bipartisan basis in 2008 to lift the moratoria on offshore energy production. Since taking office, President Obama and his administration have effectively reimposed a moratorium, and this bill will reverse his actions. This amendment proposed to take America in exactly the wrong direction in which we should be heading. Congress should not foreclose the possibility of future energy production. With the price of gasoline going to $4 and $5 a gallon, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and keep our focus on those offshore areas that contain substantial oil and natural resources, where increased American energy production will create new jobs, lower energy prices, and increase our economic and national security. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alaska reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to point out that the majority party has told me and told my staff that the bill that they have offered today, the bill that we're going to be voting on, does not affect the north coast of California. Now, my effort with this amendment is merely to trust but verify. And to oppose this amendment really calls into question what is the underlying motivation of this bill. Does it do what they claim and not affect this region of our ocean? Again, one of only 4 major upwellings in the world's oceans. This is an area that feeds and promotes the fisheries and the marine life, not only in my area, but in all the ocean. And the idea that we would put it at any kind of risk, and those of you who know the area know how rough the water is, know how rocky the shores are. If there was an oil spill there, it would never be cleaned up. And the area is seismically active. To drill in that area with the threat of earthquakes, you're looking at a situation that would make the Gulf of Mexico disaster pale in comparison. It's not too much to ask that we merely verify what it is the majority party says that they are not doing with this bill. And the idea that this amendment would be opposed is quite startling to me. I believe that this is something that everyone can get behind, and to say that the bill doesn't do this and then refuse to take the amendment calls into question the motive of the bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The
How much
gentleman
time do
from
I have left,
Alaska.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman has 3.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, my good friend from California brings out some legitimate points. But right now, today, under existing law, the Northern California planning area is available for leasing. This bill does not change that current situation. It's been available since 2008 when gasoline prices hit $4 a gallon, and the President and Congress lifted the offshore drilling moratorium. I'll remind the House that in 2008, the coast of California was open for potential leasing and drilling, that the Democrats were in the majority in the House, and Nancy Pelosi of San Francisco was Speaker of the House. For months, they resisted Republican efforts to end the offshore ban, but eventually the American people won out and the bans were lifted. I'd also like to point out that this bill provides direction that when the federal government is writing 5-year leasing plans, that the focus be on areas with the greatest estimated oil and natural gas resources. This particular planning area does not have and has not registered high in this regard, and this bill does not direct that leasing occur in this planning area. With gasoline back in 2008 of highs of $4 per gallon, let's keep the focus on where it should be, increasing Alaskan offshore energy production. That's what we're trying to do, and I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Indiana.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I don't know that there's a great deal more to add to what he's just said about permits and about the issue that's been discussed just recently. The thing that really bothers me is just a few years ago, 25 years ago, we were importing about 28% of our oil. Today, we're importing 62% of our oil, more than double what we were doing just a few years ago. And the American people are paying the price. Instead of $1.50 or $2 a gallon for gas, they're spending $4 a gallon for gasoline. In the Gulf of Mexico, there's an estimated 86 billion barrels, nationwide, there's 86 billion barrels of oil. 51% of that's in the Gulf of Mexico, which means there's 44 billion barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's 240 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. For us to continue to be dependent on foreign energy sources is crazy. We ought to start drilling and doing what needs to be done here in America, and we can do it in an environmentally safe way. We can do it in Alaska, offshore. We can do it in a number of places. But to sit by and continue to send our money to Saudi Arabia and other countries around the world that aren't our friends just doesn't make any sense. And the American people understand it. And I think my colleagues on both sides of the aisle ought to go back and talk to their constituents who are paying the price at the gas pump. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman from Alaska has 30 seconds remaining.
He's finished, isn't he? He's out of time?
Yes. The gentleman from California has yielded back. Sorry?
I yield back. The
gentleman yields back. All time having expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
the amendment
request a roll call vote.
The gentleman from California requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report 112-74. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report Number 112-74, offered by Mr. Inslee of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 257, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Inslee, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield so much time as I may consume. I rise
The gentleman
to
is
protect
recognized.
the beaches and shoreline and economy of the state of Washington. This amendment is quite simple. It would simply say that we will not allow the federal government to run over the state of Washington on issues of drilling off of our coastline, that we won't be shackled to this antiquated policy of drilling without first providing reasonable protection, without first addressing the issue of rampant speculation that is what is exposing my consumers to $4 a gallon gas in the state of Washington, and without freeing us to do what we should be doing, which is developing new clean energy sources. And I want to address each one of those. Basically, our position is we don't think in the state of Washington or in any state, and particularly the state of Washington, which is the evergreen state, we ought to have this policy foisted upon us that is not an evergreen energy policy for this century for 3 reasons. Reason number 1, despite the fact that we've had this enormous passage of time since this horrendous spill in the Gulf, this chamber has not passed into law one single safety provision to bring additional safety to anywhere in our coastline. And my amendment would simply say that the people of the state of Washington and their elected officials ought to be able to make a decision that we've got adequate, reasonable safeguards for drilling before it happens off of the state of Washington. That has not happened, and it's inexcusable. Second, before this happens, the people of the state of Washington ought to have reasonable protection against the rampant speculation that's going on that's driving up these prices. Even Goldman Sachs has recognized we've had 4 times the speculative positions taken, and probably a $20 amount have driven up these prices associated with this unchecked speculation. And yet this chamber and my friends across the aisle have not done a single thing to address this speculation. And until we do that, we shouldn't have my neighbors and my constituents foisted down their throats this policy of mandatory drilling without them first making a decision. And third, the people of the state of Washington want to help in our energy crisis. And they are capable of helping in this energy crisis if this chamber will just free them to do it. Now, here's how they want to help. They want to produce lithium-ion batteries that can run electric cars so we don't have to start being shackled just addicted to oil. But this chamber hasn't done a single thing this year to help clean energy sources that Washington State business people want to produce. I look at the Energy 2 company that's making ultracapacitors. This chamber isn't helping them make electric batteries for electric cars. I look at the REC company in Moses Lake, Washington, that are making the polysilicate cells for photovoltaic cells to produce the electricity for electric cars. This chamber hasn't done a single thing to help that company advance. I look at the Targeted Growth Company and the Boeing company that are developing biofuels so that we can have a competitor to gasoline, so we can drive those prices down. This chamber hasn't done a single thing to help those companies develop Washington State jobs for a new energy future. Now, we've got a lot of energy off of our coastlines. You know, it might be assorted ways, but I know it's an offshore wind, but we're not doing a single thing to help the offshore wind industry. All we're doing is trying to shackle an antiquated energy policy on the people of the state of Washington. Now, I would like this amendment to have helped all of my colleagues in the Pacific Coast, but because some of the financial rules that we have only been able to bring this involving the Evergreen State. But I would hope that all of my colleagues would join me in saying that before this gets forced on the citizens of Washington State, we adopt some reasonable measures, and I'll retain the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves his time.